My name is Diana Stacy, and on January 14th, 2019, my entire life changed forever. It started as just another cold winter morning in Cincinnati, Ohio. The streets were covered in ice, the air was crisp, and everything seemed so still. I wrapped my coat tighter around me as I stepped out onto my porch, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. I had no idea that within seconds, my life as I knew it would be over. As I walked down my front steps, my foot slipped on a hidden patch of ice. Before I could react, my body flew backward, and my head struck the pavement with an impact so forceful that I barely registered the pain. It was a sharp, searing sensation, but it lasted only a moment before everything went completely silent. The cold that had stung my skin just seconds ago was gone. The weight of my body vanished, and suddenly, I wasn't in my driveway anymore. I wasn't even in the world I had known. I found myself surrounded by a radiant, living light, unlike anything I had ever seen before. It wasn't just bright, it was warm, alive, and filled with something I can only describe as love itself. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't confused. I wasn't in pain anymore. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as if every burden I had ever carried had been lifted in an instant. That's when I became aware of something, or rather someone, standing with me. I turned, and the moment my eyes met his, I knew exactly who he was. Jesus. His presence was unlike anything I had ever felt. He didn't need to introduce himself, and I didn't need to ask where I was. I just knew. It was as if every question I had ever had about life, about death, about what comes next, was answered in a single moment. And yet, there was something in his eyes that held more than just love. There was sorrow, a deep sadness, and I would soon find out why. Before I could say a word, Jesus lifted his hand ever so slightly, and in that instant, something passed between us. Not in words, not in sound, but in pure understanding. It was as if he had opened my soul and allowed me to see what he saw, to feel what he felt. I realized then that he knew everything about me. Every thought I had ever had, every mistake I had ever made, every moment of doubt, and every time I had whispered his name in desperation. And yet, there was no judgment, no anger, no disappointment, only love, a love so deep and so complete that it made everything else I had ever called love feel small in comparison. I wanted to speak, to ask where I was, why this was happening, if I was going to stay here forever. But before I could even form the words, Jesus spoke first. His voice wasn't like anything I had ever heard. It wasn't loud, yet it echoed through me. It wasn't soft, yet it carried more weight than any voice I had ever known. "There is something you need to see," he said, and the moment those words left his lips, everything around me shifted. The warmth remained, the peace never left me, but suddenly, I wasn't in that glowing, heavenly space anymore. Instead, I was looking down at the world, but not as I had known it before. I saw cities stretched out in all directions, streets filled with people, and churches standing tall among them. At first glance, everything seemed normal. People were going about their lives, talking, laughing, working, praying. But the longer I watched, the more I realized that something was deeply wrong. I saw walls that weren't physical but spiritual. They were everywhere, invisible to the people walking past them, but clear as day to me. I looked closer, and my heart sank. People were divided, not just by race, but by resentment, by unspoken wounds, by history that had never been healed. I saw people carrying pain that didn't even belong to them, pain passed down from generation to generation. I saw others who had chosen to turn a blind eye, acting as if that pain didn't exist. And worst of all, I saw this same division inside the church. People who claimed to worship the same God, to follow the same Jesus, yet they refused to stand together. I turned to him, my chest tight with emotion. "Why is it like this?" I asked, even though deep down I already knew the answer. Jesus looked at me, his expression filled with both love and sorrow. "They have forgotten," he said, his voice carrying a weight that sent a shiver through me. I turned back to the world below and saw it in a way I never had before. I saw people who looked at each other with suspicion, judgment, and fear, not because they truly hated one another, but because they had been taught to. I saw wounds that had never healed, injustices that had been ignored, and a history that had been repeated over and over again. It was as if humanity had been caught in an endless cycle, too blind to see that they were fighting battles that Jesus had already won. I watched as families sat together, yet their hearts were worlds apart. I saw churches filled with people who claimed to love their neighbors, but only if they looked and lived like them. I saw people who had been hurt by racism, by rejection, by the weight of a world that had told them they were less. But then I also saw people burdened by guilt for things they never did, people who were afraid to speak, afraid to reach out, afraid that no matter what they said or did, it would never be enough. And in the midst of it all, I saw the enemy, watching, smiling, feeding the fire of division, whispering lies into the ears of the broken, convincing them that unity was impossible, that healing would never come. Jesus didn't have to say anything for me to understand what he was showing me. The world had allowed race, culture, and history to become walls instead of bridges. People had been taught to define themselves by their skin color, their nationality, their status, instead of by their identity in him. Some had suffered greatly and carried that pain like a shield, unwilling to let it go. Others had chosen to ignore the suffering altogether, pretending it didn't exist because it was easier that way. And as a result, the world had become exactly what the enemy wanted, divided, wounded, and blind to the only thing that could truly heal it. I turned back to Jesus, my voice trembling. Can it change? The question felt so small in the face of what I was seeing, but I needed to know. I needed to hear it from him. His eyes met mine, filled with that same deep, unshakable love. "They must return to me," he said. "Only my love can heal what the world has broken." The truth of his words settled into my soul, deeper than anything I had ever known. This wasn't just a vision. This was a message, a warning. And I was beginning to understand that I had not been shown this just to witness it. I had been shown this because I was meant to do something about it. Before I could even process what that meant, everything around me shifted again. I was no longer watching the world from above. I was in it. I found myself standing in the middle of a crowded street, surrounded by people who couldn't see me. I could hear their conversations, see their faces, feel the tension in the air. I saw a man clutching his child's hand tighter when another man of a different race walked past. I saw a woman crossing the street to avoid someone she had been taught to fear. I saw friends sitting together, smiling, laughing, but deep down, there were things they never spoke about, conversations they avoided because they didn't want to face the discomfort of truth. Then I saw churches, places that were supposed to represent the love of Christ, yet they were divided too. Congregations separated not by doctrine, but by skin color, by culture, by an unspoken agreement that had gone unquestioned for too long. I saw pastors preaching about love, but never addressing the divisions sitting right in front of them. I saw worship teams leading songs about unity, while their own hearts remained closed off to those who didn't look like them. It was a silent separation, one that no one wanted to admit was still there. Jesus stood beside me, watching it all. His face was filled with sorrow, but there was something else there too: urgency. "This is not what I wanted," he said softly. His words cut through me, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. This was never his plan for us. He never created different races, so we could separate ourselves from one another. He never meant for history to be used as a weapon to keep people apart. Humanity had done this. The enemy had taken something that was meant to be beautiful, diversity, and twisted it into something that caused pain and resentment. I felt my heart breaking as I watched people continue in their ways, unaware of how deceived they had been. It wasn't just about racism. It wasn't just about injustice. It was about how people had allowed the world to tell them who they were instead of listening to the one who created them. It was about how generations of pain had been carried forward instead of healed. It was about how people had chosen fear instead of love, bitterness instead of forgiveness. And yet, Jesus wasn't showing me this just to grieve over it. He was showing me because he wanted me to understand that it could change. But only if people were willing to listen. The world around me shifted once more, and suddenly, I wasn't just watching the division, I was feeling it. It was like waves of pain pressing down on me, the weight of centuries of hurt, misunderstandings, and unspoken wounds. I saw families torn apart, friendships that never formed because of assumptions, entire communities built on the foundation of us versus them. And then I saw the whispers, the lies, the enemy planting thoughts into people's minds, feeding the idea that reconciliation was impossible, that love wasn't enough to heal what had been broken. But then, just as the sorrow threatened to consume me, Jesus stretched out his hand. In an instant, I saw something new, something different. I saw what could happen if people truly chose him. I saw churches tearing down their walls, not just physically, but spiritually. I saw people reaching across barriers that had kept them apart for so long, choosing to listen, choosing to understand. I saw real, deep forgiveness. Not the kind that the world offers, but the kind that only comes from knowing Christ. It wasn't forced, it wasn't shallow, it was genuine. People weren't ignoring history, they were learning from it, but they were no longer letting it define their relationships today. I saw young people refusing to inherit the bitterness of past generations. I saw leaders speaking truth, not in a way that created more division, but in a way that called people back to the heart of God. I saw worship services where people of all backgrounds stood side by side, lifting their hands in unity, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. And for the first time since this vision began, I felt hope. Jesus looked at me again, and this time, there was no sorrow in his voice, only certainty. "This is what I desire," he said, "that they love one another." Tears filled my eyes as I realized the weight of what he was telling me. This wasn't just a vision to witness, this was a call to action. This was why he had brought me here. It wasn't enough to see the problem. It wasn't enough to acknowledge it. People had to make a choice. They had to decide if they would continue letting the world define them, or if they would finally surrender to the truth that Jesus had already paid for their unity. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, I felt myself being pulled away. The vision, the warmth, the presence of Jesus, it all started to fade. In an instant, everything collapsed into darkness. The warmth, the light, the presence of Jesus gone. I felt myself being pulled backward, like I was being yanked from a place I wasn't ready to leave. Then, just as suddenly as I had left my body, I was back. A rush of cold air filled my lungs, my chest rose sharply, and I gasped. My body felt heavy again, the weight of the world pressing down on me. Voices filled the air, panicked, desperate. Someone was shaking me, calling my name. I could barely process what was happening. My vision was blurry, my head throbbed, and my body ached all over. As the world around me came into focus, I saw the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the icy pavement. A paramedic was leaning over me, checking my pulse, shining a flashlight into my eyes. "Danielle, "Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice urgent. I wanted to respond, but my mind was still trapped in what I had just experienced. I wasn't just waking up from an accident. I was returning from something far greater, something I couldn't even begin to explain. As they loaded me into the ambulance, my neighbor, Lisa, stood nearby, tears streaming down her face. "I thought you were gone," she whispered, gripping my hand as they lifted me onto the stretcher. I wanted to tell her that she was right. I had been gone. I had died. And yet here I was, alive. But I knew I hadn't come back on my own. Jesus had sent me back. And not just to live, but to tell. To speak the truth about what he had shown me. To tell the world that we were running out of time to fix what had been broken. The ride to the hospital was a blur. My mind was racing, my spirit still caught between two realities. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding as I replayed everything Jesus had shown me. The division, the pain, the brokenness, and the hope. The healing that was possible if only people would choose it. I wasn't sure how to explain it, how to even begin telling people what I had seen. But deep down, I knew I had no choice. This wasn't just a dream. It wasn't just some strange vision. This was real. And I had been sent back with a mission. When I woke up in the hospital the next morning, everything felt different. The weight of what I had seen, what I had been told, was pressing against my chest. I wasn't the same person who had fallen the day before. Something inside me had changed, something I knew I could never ignore. As I lay there, staring at the white ceiling tiles, I kept hearing his words over and over again. Go back. Tell them. It was as if they were etched into my very soul, a command that I could not escape. My family arrived later that day, their faces filled with relief and concern. My mother, Patricia, grabbed my hand, her eyes wet with tears. "We thought we lost you," she whispered. My sister, Erica, sat quietly beside me, watching, waiting. And then there was my husband, Michael. He stood near the foot of the bed, arms crossed, his face unreadable. I could already see the hesitation in his eyes. He didn't believe in miracles. He didn't believe in things that couldn't be explained. And I knew, without even speaking, that what I was about to say was going to change everything between us. I took a deep breath. "I died," I said simply. The room went silent. My mother gasped, my sister leaned forward, and Michael just stared at me. I was gone, but Jesus, he brought me back. I expected them to interrupt, to ask questions, but no one said a word. So I kept going. I told them everything. How I had left my body, how I stood before Jesus, how he had shown me the division in the world, the pain, the hatred, the way people had been blinded by history and fear. I told them about the churches, the lies, the way even believers had allowed themselves to be separated. And then I told them about what could be, what Jesus wanted for us. How he showed me that unity was possible, that forgiveness was the only way forward, that his love was the only thing strong enough to break the chains of division. My mother cried softly, clutching her cross necklace. My sister just sat there, nodding, as if she had always known something like this could happen. But Michael, he shook his head. "Danielle, you hit your head hard," he said slowly, trying to sound calm. "The doctors said it's a miracle you don't have a concussion. Maybe your mind was just trying to make sense of what happened. I expected this. I knew this was coming, but that didn't make it hurt any less. I know what I saw," I told him, my voice steady. "And nothing you say will change that." The conversation with my family ended the way I expected. My mother praying under her breath, my sister deep in thought, and Michael still looking at me like I had just told him I'd seen a ghost. And in a way, I had. But it wasn't some hallucination. And it wasn't just my brain trying to make sense of trauma. It was real. I had stood before Jesus. I had looked into his eyes. And I had been sent back for a reason. The next few days felt surreal. I was physically healing, but my spirit was restless. I couldn't shake the urgency in my heart, the overwhelming feeling that I needed to speak. But where would I even begin? Who would listen to me? Would people think I was crazy? Doubt tried to creep in, whispering that I should keep this to myself, that no one would believe me. But every time those thoughts surfaced, I heard his words again, go back.
Tell them.
I decided to start with my church. That Sunday, I sat in the congregation like I always had, but everything felt different. The music, the prayers, even the sermon, it all felt so surface level compared to what I had seen. These people, the ones I had worshipped beside for years, had no idea how much was at stake, how much they were missing. As the service ended, I knew I had to say something. My heart was pounding as I walked up to my pastor, Reverend Coleman, and asked if I could speak. He hesitated, clearly unsure, but eventually nodded and handed me the microphone. I took a deep breath and faced the congregation.
I died, I said.
The murmur of conversation faded into silence, and I saw Jesus. A few people shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned in, their eyes wide with curiosity. And he gave me a message, one that we all need to hear. I told them everything just as I had told my family. The division, the pain, the deception that had kept people apart for so long. I told them how the enemy had tricked us into believing that race, history, and culture were more important than the unity we were meant to have in Christ. I told them that Jesus was weeping for the way we treated each other, that he was calling us back, calling us to love each other the way he loves us. As I spoke, I could feel the weight of my words settling over the congregation. Some people nodded, their faces filled with emotion, while others sat frozen, as if they weren't sure whether to believe me or dismiss me. I saw a woman in the front row wipe away tears. I saw a man gripping his Bible, so tightly his knuckles turned white. But I also saw those who refused to meet my gaze, shifting in their seats, uncomfortable with the truth I was sharing. I didn't stop. I told them about the vision Jesus showed me, the way people had allowed race, pain, and history to keep them apart. I told them how the enemy had twisted something as beautiful as diversity into a weapon of division, how we had let ourselves be deceived into believing that we were too different to ever truly stand together. Jesus showed me what could be, I said, my voice trembling. I saw people choosing forgiveness. I saw churches breaking down the barriers that had kept them apart. I saw families healing from wounds they had carried for generations. And I saw the enemy losing his grip. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then, my pastor stepped forward and took the microphone from my shaking hands. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. He looked out at the congregation, then back at me. I don't know what to say, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I believe you. His words sent a ripple through the church. A few people started clapping. Others bowed their heads in prayer. And then something I never expected happened. People started confessing. One by one, members of the church stood up, admitting the prejudices they had held in their hearts, the resentment they had carried, the silent walls they had built. Some apologized to people sitting just a few seats away. Others wept openly, finally letting go of burdens they had never spoken about. It was the beginning of something new, something real. This wasn't just a church service anymore. It was a moment of transformation. And I knew, deep in my soul, that this was only the beginning. In the days that followed, word spread about what had happened that Sunday morning. People who hadn't been there started asking questions. Some were curious, some were skeptical, and some outright dismissed my story. But none of that mattered because I had done what Jesus told me to do. I had spoken the truth. And even though I knew not everyone would believe me, I also knew that those who had ears to hear would listen. I started getting phone calls from people I hadn't talked to in years. Some wanted to share their own struggles with division and forgiveness. Others wanted to argue, convinced that the world's problems were too big for faith alone to solve. I even had a few people tell me I was being too spiritual about an issue that was purely political, but they didn't understand. This wasn't about politics. This wasn't about one group versus another. This was about souls. This was about eternity. This was about Jesus calling his people back before it was too late. The following Sunday, something incredible happened. 2 churches in our community, one predominantly white, one predominantly black, decided to hold a joint service together for the first time in their history. I sat in the front row as I watched people from both congregations worship side by side. There was no division, no separation, just voices lifted in praise to the same God. It was one of the most powerful things I had ever witnessed, and I knew, in that moment, that this was exactly what Jesus had shown me. But even as I saw the beginnings of healing, I also felt the weight of something heavier pressing on my heart. This wasn't just about our town or our churches. This was about the world. The enemy wanted us to believe that reconciliation was impossible. He wanted us to stay divided, to let bitterness and pain keep us apart. And that's why Jesus had sent me back. Because there wasn't much time left. Because the church needed to wake up. Because the time for healing wasn't someday in the future. It was now. As the weeks passed, I couldn't ignore the urgency I felt in my spirit. What Jesus had shown me wasn't just for my church, my town, or even just for believers. It was for everyone. The world had been trapped in division for too long, blinded by anger, fear, and a history that refused to heal. But I had seen the truth. I had seen that it could heal if only people would surrender to the love of Christ. If only they would stop seeing each other through the eyes of the world and start seeing each other the way he did. I started sharing my testimony wherever I could. I spoke at other churches, at small gatherings, even online. Some people listened with open hearts. Others pushed back, unwilling to accept that Jesus was the only answer. I remember one man approaching me after a service, his voice filled with frustration. "So, you're saying all we have to do is forgive and everything will be fine?" he asked, his arms crossed. "What about justice? What about the pain that people have suffered?" I looked him in the eyes and said, "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but refusing to forgive makes sure the pain never ends." He didn't respond right away. He just stood there, staring at me, and I could see the battle happening in his heart. Because deep down, he knew I was right. The world had convinced us that the only way to fix injustice was to stay angry, to keep our walls up, to never let go. But Jesus had already paid the price for healing. The only thing stopping us from walking in it was us. One night, as I sat in my room, replaying everything I had been through, I felt the presence of Jesus again. It wasn't the same as when I had stood before him, but it was real. I closed my eyes, and in my spirit, I could hear his voice. "Keep going. They need to hear." I knew then that this was my purpose now. I hadn't just been sent back to tell my story once and move on. I had been sent back to be a voice, to wake people up, to call them back to love, to unity, to truth. So, now I'm asking you, what will you do with this message? Will you let the world keep telling you who to love and who to hate? Will you let the pain of the past control your future? Or will you surrender it all to Jesus and finally let him heal what has been broken? Because I promise you, no government, no law, no movement will ever bring the healing that only he can. The time for change isn't later. It's now. If this message spoke to you, I ask you to share it. Not for me, but so that others can hear the truth. so that others can know what Jesus showed me, so that together we can finally break the chains that have kept us apart for far too long. Jesus is calling. The question is, will you answer?